Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar we are organizing in the frame of the Inclusive Schools project. Kalispera se olus. Most of you are coming from Greece, as I see. And this is a webinar organized on the occasion of celebrating the Erasmus Days, a pan-European celebration of the Erasmus Plus program. And we're participating in this with this webinar that is going to be led by our very good collaborator, San Williams. She's been the author of the education pack of the Inclusive Schools project, which has been running since 2019, January 2019. You can see the link of the project right on your chat box. I am Irini Careta. I am the manager of the project. And we've been working around inclusion in order to embed methodologies for inclusion along with the school community in schools across Europe. We are 7 partners altogether. The British Council is leading on the project. It's co-funded by the Erasmus Plus project program of the European Commission. And among our partners coming from Poland, Belgium, Spain, the UK and Greece, it's the Institute of Education Policy in Greece. So I will give the floor to our presenter today, Sian Williams, an education expert. She is the author of our education pack, which you can find uploaded on the Inclusive Schools site. So many thanks for your participation here today. I think it's going to be a very interesting presentation. So thank you all. And Sian, hello.
Hello, thank you, Irini, and Kalispera, everybody, and bonsoir. And I'm not sure who else we've got, but hello to everybody. So thank you. I shall begin. So thank you very much for having me, everybody, and thank you for giving up your time this afternoon. I am going to be mostly telling you some stories this afternoon. I have had the privilege of speaking to people working in a variety of European countries about their inclusive practice over lockdown and also on the return to school in the past couple of weeks. So I'm really going to tell you what's going on in schools across Europe and also in Lebanon this afternoon. But I'm going to talk in 2 parts. The first part's going to be shorter, but I do want to set the context for inclusion and what these schools are working in, the big picture context. And then the much longer second part of the presentation will be about what the schools are doing and their experiences. We start really with 2 statements about inclusion. All children have an entitlement to education, and all children have the capacity to make progress. And as a world, we have been working on these for at least kind of 30 years globally, but it's proving to be very difficult to put the first statement into practice and get all children into school, and also to change the beliefs of people around children and their capacity to make progress. So a number of things have happened globally to help this to happen. Just to give you some context of where we are. So 1989 was the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that enshrined the right of education for all children. And that was followed in 1990 by the Education for All World Conference, which had a really big, which really stressed getting all children into school. 1994 on the right there was the Salamanca Statement, which was really the first time that globally a statement had been put together by people about the education of children with special educational needs and disabilities in a way that was inclusive. And then at the bottom there, you can see the development goals. On the left, at the Millennium Development Goal that we worked 2000 to 2015, which was getting every child into primary education across the world. We didn't get there, but we made progress. And now Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is not just about getting everybody into education, but making sure that everybody gets a quality education that is relevant and empowers them to be able to go on to lifelong learning. And also Sustainable Development Goal 4 has a focus on any group that is marginalised. So we're talking about inclusion. Often inclusion gets mixed up with people just thinking it's about special educational needs and disability. It's not. It's about every single marginalised group. And SDG makes that really quite clear. We have the European Social Charter and also the European Convention on Human Rights. And both of those, again, echo the enshrining of education as a right for all children. And then the Council of Europe wrote this statement earlier this year during the pandemic, saying that even in times of crisis, which we are definitely in a crisis at the moment, even when we're in a crisis, the fundamental right to education is still there, even if it has to be adapted. And all of those different ways of adapting are what we're going to be talking about with the schools this afternoon that I interviewed. Underpinning that in Europe, we have these European values, which we're all familiar with. And in 2015 in Paris, the education ministers got together after terrorist attacks in France and Denmark, and they reaffirmed their solidarity and also committed to embedding through education a really big focus on tolerance and non-discrimination and freedom being delivered through education. So there was a big move for schools across Europe to be teaching these values as well, which are, of course, inclusive values. Why is inclusion important? Well, on a global scale, we know that if we get it right and we have less children dropping out and more children being included throughout their school career, then we know that this will reduce poverty and crime. It will make gender equality better. It will improve health. And also in places in the world that have a very high birth rate, it brings that birth rate down and helps people manage their families better. And also it helps us to keep up with demand for skills that are ever changing. So the only way that we can make skills taught for how we need to live our lives is if we can keep people in school for longer. So that's why it's important on a global level. And why schools need to be inclusive. There are three reasons that Salamanca set out. There's, why is it a good idea to have inclusive schools? They talked about having regular inclusive schools as for three reasons. One is that it's the best place for children to learn the values that we've been talking about already and to build an inclusive society going forward. So if you have an inclusive school, you will have children coming out of those schools with having a really open attitude to difference and diversity in the world. The second reason is that we know enough now about inclusive education to know that it really does provide an effective education in terms of outcomes for the majority of children. Thirdly, it's cheaper actually to have all children in the same school being educated together. Now, that isn't to say that everybody is doing this. It's an aspiration. There are some countries that have all of their children in the same school. So Finland, Estonia, Italy shut all their special schools. But we have also many countries that still run a two-track system of special schools and non-special schools. But it's an aspiration. And all of the schools that we're talking about today are working towards becoming more inclusive. When we talk about it, in terms of the British Council, there's a real danger with inclusion to think that we've got to talk about it in terms of all schools meeting the needs of all children. But actually, this means that if one child gets left behind or just doesn't do as well as expected or drops out, then it's almost like the whole system has failed. And it creates quite a lot of frustration and guilt and shame in the system. So we talk about more schools meeting the needs of more children. So every step that you take to becoming more inclusive means that you are taking steps to including more of the children that you teach in more of the time and for more of the time. And this doesn't necessarily require teachers to do anything hugely different to very good teaching practices. That's actually what we're talking about, is really quality everyday practice. And what that does is it means that we're providing something that is equitable, which is different from equality. So on the left, we've got a picture of equality, which looks fair because everybody's given the same thing. Everybody's got a box. But actually in real life, you can see that that doesn't work because everybody's needs are different. So what we're talking about in terms of inclusive education is we're talking about equity in the middle there. So people's needs that are different are met in different ways. That's what people try to do when they provide an inclusive education. But we also talk, perhaps with a bit more aspiration, to moving towards a society and an education system where there just aren't any barriers to education, where everybody goes to a school that can cater for their needs, and it's just the usual, it's the done thing. But we're not there yet. Where we are is really we're better at making equitable education. And we do that, and this shift happens through using the social model of disability. And what this model does is it says, okay, society creates the barriers, not a person. So a person that might have a disability or is different in some way, shape or form, it's not just disability. You might be talking about a refugee or a migrant who's different from most of the population in a particular country. Society creates those barriers, and therefore it's society that has to take those barriers away and has to think about how they make society accessible. And when we're talking about schools, we're talking about microcosms of society. So each school community needs to be responsible for removing the barriers to inclusion. And this is a process. It's not a tick box product. It's a journey. And it's actually a journey that never finishes, because different children arrive in schools all the time from different areas of the world with different needs, different setups at home, all of those kind of things. So it really is a road upon which we travel. And we talk about two ways of really making education inclusive in schools, and the journey towards inclusive education takes in two components. One is about actually getting children into school, so that access. So the part that we talked about in Millennium Development Goal and education for all. So the access has to be there. You've got to have the children in school. And the other one is making sure that what is being accessed in school is relevant and empowering. So that's your curriculum and the way that curriculum is taught, and your extracurricular work and everything else that you do. But we talk about that as being engagement, and every school that's going on this journey towards inclusive education will look at their access and their engagement policies and practice. And a lot can be done actually in schools by thinking about values and putting values into practice. There's a perception that if you don't have a whole load of money, you can't make your school more inclusive. You can. Obviously, there is there's a big place for resources and support, in the form of people that cost money, but a lot can be done on quite a deep level just by thinking about some of these values and putting them into practice, changing the way that conversations happen, listening, and all of that kind of thing. And you'll see a lot of these values in action when I talk about the schools in a minute. So that's the picture. We know that we've made quite a lot of progress. We're not there yet with access or engagement in any way, shape or form. But then March hit, or January, February, March, Covid-19 hit, and we find ourselves in a predicament. So we know that over lockdown, 94% of children across the world were out of school. So it's 1.58 billion. And because of that, 370 million of them didn't get enough to eat. We know that 463 billion children couldn't access education during that time, just because 40% of countries didn't have the infrastructure to deliver any sort of distance learning. And we also have now a 29% funding shortfall to help us reach that target of quality education by 2030. So before COVID, the funding shortfall was 11%. So that's a big jump. And there is now a global program to try and persuade governments and donors to fill this shortfall, because they think big problems are coming if we don't do that. Those young people who were already at risk of marginalisation are going to be disproportionately affected and way into the future by what's happening right now. So we are at a point of quite a big pressure on schools to be doing some really stupendous work. And what I've been able to do over the last couple of weeks is talk to schools in 5 countries about what they've been doing. And these are all schools or practitioners that are known for their kind of inclusive practice. So I talked to somebody in England, I talked to a play therapist. In Greece, I talked to a grade 4 teacher, and I also talked to Phaedra, who I know is online. Hello, Phaedra, who's been working with them on the in-school inclusive schools project. I've talked to a head teacher in Lebanon, which was fascinating and will be a completely different experience from the European experience. I talked to an assistant head teacher in Scotland with responsibility for children who have additional needs. And in Spain, I talked to a head teacher and their specialist teacher for children with special educational needs and disabilities. And I talked to each of them for about 45 minutes, an hour, and just found out what was going on for them in terms of lockdown practice, what they did in terms of inclusive practice during lockdown, the challenges and responses, what they're doing now, because they're all back at school. Scotland went back in August and everybody else has gone back in September. So what's going on now? What are they thinking about looking ahead? And what are their needs, immediate needs, and future needs? So in terms of challenges, there were 4 main challenges. Everybody almost shared universally. And the first one, you won't be surprised, was technology. And so there were several layers of challenge that went on here for schools. The first one was the speed at which the shift had to happen from being in the classroom to children being at home and things moving online. So, for example, in Scotland, the teacher talked about having 2 days to turn things around and get things from classroom to computer. And this wasn't uncommon. Certainly in the UK, it was a very, very short turnaround time. And this speed meant that a number of decisions had to be taken and a number of things had to happen in schools. So firstly, which online platform are we going to use? How do we know which one's best? Everybody's using different things in the classroom. How are we going to pick one? So different countries and different schools had different responses. So in Scotland, the school decided to use Teams, like we're using. In Greece, Phaedra will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we started out on Zoom, and then the government decided to change that to another provider. So there was a shift that had to happen there. Lebanon, they were fortunate in that the school is part of a foundation, and they already have their own online learning platform that's come on a long way since lockdown, but that's where they went, and it was a natural choice for them. And in Spain, they can't remember which one they decided on, but everybody was using completely different things, and they had to all focus on one at great speed. And then once they decided that, okay, so who knows how to use this, and how can you train other people to use it quickly, please? And not just teachers, but parents and children as well, so that everybody felt comfortable in learning on that platform. So that was a massive task, because, I mean, we're on Teams. Some of you will be really great with technology, and some of you, it's kind of something that we've had to learn through lockdown, and teachers are no different. Some people love it, some people just don't. So that was a really big deal for some people. And in Greece, there was one teacher in the school that I spoke to who they never managed to get online. So her colleagues helped with that side of things. So, and while racing all through this, teachers also had to address the problems, or schools had to address the problems of the digital divide. So what do you do about children and families that just don't have access to technology? And again, this response was different. So in Scotland, they were able to, most of their children had laptops, and they were able to get some donations from the community to support that and give some school laptops out, which is also what they did in Spain. But in Scotland, they still, after all of that, had 30 children, and that's about 10% of their children in the school who had no technological access at all. So they had to account for that during lockdown as well, and deliver work packs. In Greece, the focus was much more on using phones, because most people had smartphones. But even then, there was an example of one dad who had to be very much persuaded to share his smartphone with his 2 boys. And, you know, it was a conversation about, okay, what are the priorities here? And in Lebanon, things were very different again. Not everybody had a smartphone, but everybody had a TV. So they explored lots of different options. And eventually somebody said, hey, DVD players are really cheap nowadays. Why don't we buy a load of cheap DVD players and give them to the families that don't have access online, and we can put all the learning materials on DVD players, on DVDs, and then deliver them to the home. And that's what they did. In England, the play therapist, she actually had to work from her car because that was the only private space that she had, because she had her own children. So she was on her smartphone, sometimes on video with children if they had video and they wanted to use it, and sometimes not. So again, another different approach to technology there. So you can see the variety of the responses that this is starting to bring about, and that will be a theme that you see as we go through now too. So the second big shared lockdown challenge was around engagement and motivation, and this was just as much parents as children, according to the schools that I talked to, particularly parents of children with special educational needs. Not because they didn't want to support their children, but because they didn't feel very confident in the skills that they had to support them in learning. So again, there were a huge variety of responses to support for this. So we had people going to talk to parents on doorsteps in Scotland when they delivered the work packs and talk through that and make sure parents felt comfortable about what they were doing. In Lebanon, not only did they make DVDs for the children, they also made DVDs for the parents. And they started off just by encouraging the parents to interact with the children, not to do any learning activities, just to play with them, find a toy, and get confident. And then slowly they built in learning activities and gave them DVDs to walk them through what they were supposed to be doing. In Spain and in Greece, there was, you know, and in all the other countries, there was an enormous amount of follow-up using phone, WhatsApp. So there were class WhatsApp groups all over the place to keep people engaged, video calls, going to doorsteps, putting notes under doors. So, for example, in Greece, there were 2 Syrian young girls who disappeared, and the amount of work that the school tried to do to find them was just colossal. But it proved to be very, very difficult. But one of the things that I really noticed is that there was just no giving up, and people just kept on keeping on. So, for example, in Spain, the teachers had never given out their email addresses, but now they gave out their email addresses and they're now communicating with parents by email. So just loads of different ways of doing things. One of the other practices was that in Scotland and Lebanon, they had kind of engagement checklists with the classes so that they could track the level, what the kids were doing, whether they felt that they were engaged or not and motivated, and whether they were, you know, sending stuff for the teacher to look at. And these were then shared with managers in the school, and anybody that needed additional help then was flagged up and could receive some extra follow-up. The play therapist had one child, phone disconnected, couldn't track down this child at all. So she would send cards via the school just to let that child know that he hadn't been forgotten. And I think this is the key here. The teacher from Greece summed this up really neatly. She said, you have to be there for them and they have to know that you are. And so what was really notable is that there was just this massive creativity and this massive push to keep children engaged, to keep families engaged, and to keep on doing that. And keep on trying different ways if the first one didn't work, or the second one, or the third one. So the third shared challenge was, how do you create that feeling of community, of learning in a class when you've got all these children at home on different bits of technology or no technology at all? Well, Greece and Spain, both of which the schools were in the in-school project, had really interesting ways of doing this. And I'll just detail a little bit about that. So in Greece, there was a project that involved, the in-school project involved 6 classes. So the teacher wanted to continue this project, so she got the 6 classes online, and with Phaedra's help, who's online now, they did a project about stories, starting off with telling fairy stories, but then moving into stories about difference, including kind of diversity, using some of the characters from the in-school material. And then the children went off and developed their own characteristics of characters from that, and they wrote stories about those characters, and then they shared those stories online and presented them to each other. And in between, as they were working on it, they worked in small groups online together in between the big sessions of 6 classes. In Spain, their big focus is on cooperative learning for inclusion, and they really wanted to keep that going. So a couple of examples. They also did a storytelling project. So between an older class and a younger class, who have a buddy system in the school. So the older class interviewed children in the younger class to find out their interests and their likes and their dislikes. And then based on those interviews, they wrote stories for the younger children and read them the stories online. So again, some very nice collaboration there. And they also were doing a project on the natural environment, so they kept that going, and they asked children in classes to share their knowledge and their interests in their local natural environment with classmates and also with parents who were there with, at home with the children. And that became a nice project that people could actually go outside and do things outside. So they had an example of a young man who knew a lot about birds, local birds and bird migration. And he shared his knowledge. And then lots of people went to the park to see the birds and to track the migration of the birds when it happened. So some lovely things happening that managed to bring those communities together. And the final one, and this wasn't so shared, but it was more really in Scotland and England, that other services that usually support schools stepped back. And because they weren't allowed to do their one-to-one services anymore. So schools became a real community hub, much more, they are normally, but much more than they had been in the past. So schools became responsible for delivering food parcels and toiletries to families, and things like taking children out for walks where parents had no respite. So there was an enormous amount of support coming from the schools as well as they were going through. So the overall messages from schools about lockdown practice and keeping it inclusive were really to use whatever means possible to develop tailored solutions for individual contexts. And all the staff said, well, it didn't work how we thought it was going to work. The solutions weren't necessarily the ones we thought were going to be the good solutions, but we got there in the end. And you have to be open-minded and just keep creating ideas all of the time. And the other thing that they said was, the other thing that came out really strongly was the focus on relationships between home and school, between teachers and parents and children, because it was these relationships that when the going got difficult and motivation and engagement started to drop off, made the difference. And they were able then to re-motivate and to re-engage because of the relationships that they'd set up. So that's what happened during lockdown. And broadly, those challenges are kind of reflected in the Save the Children report, which looked at the impact of COVID-19 in Europe. A couple that we haven't really picked up, the domestic violence rate, we know that went up everywhere. And actually the play therapist has had extra funding given to her on the return to school, and now has extra children that she works with who have been affected by domestic violence during that time. And then we talked about the Syrian children, the particular impact on refugee migrant children. It was very interesting, those 2 Syrian children, the guess of the teacher was that they'd probably disappeared because they were afraid of being deported if they were found, particularly found to be positive if they had COVID-19 in the family. So they just disappeared. So the fear factor is different for those refugee and migrant children. So we can see that reflected in what was going on. There were some unexpected positive outcomes as well. Lots of the teachers talked about, especially the senior teachers talked about that other teachers had become more aware of children's circumstances and how that impacted on their learning, because they kind of got to know more what was going on at home and how children lived. So teachers are found to be kind of taking on more responsibility for inclusion. This creative use of technology, okay, how are we going to use technology to keep cooperative learning, to keep people engaged? That's something that I think people are carrying forward with them and has been a positive outcome of what people told me. In Lebanon in particular, but also in Spain, they talked about independent learning skills of children. So in Lebanon, they found that particularly the children with special educational needs were being a lot more independent at home than they were in school. So they would say things to their teachers like, look, I can put the DVD in by myself, I can find the right place in the DVD, I can get the right books for the right subject, whatever I'm learning, I can find the right page, here's all my equipment. And the teachers took a step back and thought, wow, what have we been doing in school where we have been doing all of these for these children? They can do them themselves. So their expectations about what children can achieve have changed. And I think that is a really powerful thing too. We've talked about change relationships with many parents, not all, but the blurring of the lines between teachers and parents, and teachers being present on smartphones and laptops in people's homes, from their own homes, has broken down some of the hierarchical barriers between schools and homes. And we'll come on to talking about whether that's able to continue and how it might continue post-lockdown. We've talked about domestic violence. Some of what was going on wasn't apparent before and has been, because it got worse, unfortunately, issues have come to light that perhaps wouldn't have come to light otherwise, and children are safer now. And this one in Scotland, they decided when they came back to school, because they had so many people, they have staggered starts. So children come in at different times in the morning and leave at different times at night and have lunch at different times. They just decided no more bells. And the teacher I spoke to said that it's a lot less stressful with no bells. So that was a really interesting outcome as well. So that was then, this is now. They're all back at school. What is going on now? There are three, again, main themes that came out here from my conversations. The first one is about stress and anxiety. And the overwhelming message here from all of the schools was the adults are more stressed than the children. The children, because the adults have put so much work into zoning playgrounds, marking out where children can stand and can sit, one-way systems in school, how to wash your hands, all of those things have been made really clear to children. So they get them, they understand them. And in the main, of course, there's some silliness, but in the main, they're getting on with it. And they're not that stressed, apart from a group that I will talk about in a minute. So the parents and the teachers are the people that are more stressed, and perhaps this is down to fears about actually becoming infected with COVID-19 or looking after people who are vulnerable, and having more fears around infection. But also there's a great deal of uncertainty, and this was really picked up by the play therapist. She said, I can see the teachers, but we never know who's going to be in tomorrow, and we also never know if somebody is going to be there the whole day, because if you get a phone call to say your child has symptoms, or if you develop symptoms or somebody in your family develops symptoms, you have to leave straight away. So it creates this lot of uncertainty and stress about workload and sharing workload and all of those kind of things. So there's this extra pressure that comes from that. And also a possible extra pressure on the expectation on teachers that they will close the learning gap made by COVID and lockdown as quickly as possible. So this big pressure on academic outcomes, rather than thinking about kind of well-being in hand with teaching and learning. So that's something to watch as well. In response to this, senior leaders really stressed their role as people who were listening and needed to talk to staff, to give some messages of reassurance as far as they can, and support as far as they can. And I think this came out really hugely in Lebanon, which has also, as well as COVID, has two other major challenges. One, the economic situation in Lebanon, even before COVID, was falling apart, and there were street, and inflation means that the teacher salary just doesn't really go anywhere anymore. So many teachers are in financial hardship. And also then, of course, in August, the Beirut, where the school was that I spoke to, had the huge explosion, which has rocked the entire city, not just physically, but mentally as well. So they have actually sat down with every single member of staff in their school and talked through with them about how they are, what they need, and how they can help them. I said I would talk about a small group of children who the play therapist has noticed as having a higher level of anxiety, and these are the people that will change school next year. So in England, children change school when they hit 11, and these children who will go in at the end of this academic year, they saw that their friends from last year had a really bad deal, and so they are quite anxious about going to the next school next year. So her response is, okay, I normally set up groups to talk about this in April. I'm going to set up groups now so that children can just drop in at lunchtime with their friends and have a group conversation about what they're worried about. So she's noticed and she's reacted. So that's stress and anxiety. This is another big one. Everybody was talking about, okay, we want to make our learning cooperative, active, participatory, because this is how we know inclusive learning works best. How on earth do we do that when children can't do what's in that picture anymore? They can't share equipment at the moment very much. They have to be distanced from each other and everything has to be sterilised. So how do we make this happen? And the response is, some of them very pragmatic around materials of anything that can't be sterilised isn't used anymore. And then when things are shared or used, they're taken out of circulation, they're sterilised, they're quarantined, and then they're brought back when they're safe. And then the other big thing, which I'm sure you've all seen, is that children now have their own resource packs. They don't really have shared resources anymore. But the bigger question for teachers is, okay, so how can we do group work? And how can we get small group discussion, paired discussion, small group discussion going that then can feed back into the lessons? So the Spanish school was really clear about this because they have such a big emphasis on cooperative learning. And they said there was no way that they were going to give up on their group work. So they just played around with desks until they found ways that worked. And one of the ways that I'd never thought of, they said we arranged them in the shape of a flower, so that each child has their own desk and they're facing inwards, but they are far enough away from each other to be distanced, but near enough to be able to communicate in a group. So I thought that was just a really good tip there. And the other thing I really liked was the Lebanese school, the head teacher and other teachers were doing learning walks. So they were working out where teachers were perhaps a bit scared to do group work and where teachers were more confident, and getting them to talk to each other and spreading good practice and making suggestions about group work and how you can arrange group work safely. And you don't have to have the children sitting in rows and facing the front. But they all think this is just a starting point. They've got a long way to go on this because we're in this for the long haul. So it's a watch this space, that one. As is this one. So we talked a lot about parents and how things are different now for parents. So certainly in the UK, parents in primary schools have been very used to being able to drop in, just have a quick chat with the child's teacher at the beginning of the day or the end of the day while they're dropping off or picking up a child or children. That can't happen anymore. And what the play therapist has noticed, she said there always used to be parents in the school. And quite often I would see parents in deep conversations with members of staff, or even sometimes being comforted by members of staff because they were upset. And she said that's just not happening now. And they're not getting that kind of same informal access that they were before lockdown or actually during lockdown as well. So that's something that I think schools are starting to think about. The Scottish assistant head teacher, she was talking particularly about the children with special educational needs and the staggered start and finish times. And she was saying, okay, I want to use those staggered start and finish times, and I want to go out there and meet with the parents. But this was just an idea that she was starting to explore. So I think, again, that is one to watch, and it would be fascinating to revisit the practice in a few months to see what's happened with those areas. We're getting there, we're almost doing. So looking ahead, people are really working day to day at the moment. And I think this balance between health and safety, teaching and learning and well-being is a real ongoing issue, and something that people are just going to have to work their way through. But the message was very clear from the teachers. We don't want everything to be about health and safety. We want to think about teaching and learning, and we want to think about well-being. Everybody knows that in terms of technology, they've got to be on top of it now, because we are at a point in some European countries where we may be heading for another short lockdown at some point, or shorter lockdowns, and things may well go back to distance learning. So everybody knows that they've got to do it. So particularly in Spain, where they really perhaps are a little bit behind, they have now got themselves much more organised in terms of technological learning. And this one was really interesting. Again, some interesting practice from Lebanon. And I think it's so interesting because the government just doesn't really exist there at the moment. So this school is part of a foundation, and they are just thinking, okay, what's best for our children? We're going to do that. Even if the government says no, they say, well, we're going to try it anyway, and then we'll tell you if it works. So they have decided this year that they will do a blended learning model for the entire academic year, so that they have a plan and they stick to it. And it seems right at the moment quite well. They've only got some of them in at the moment. So they had the kindergarten and grade 1 back in at the beginning of September. And then at the middle of September, they had grades 2 to 6 in, and they have been bedding this model in. And then this week, because it's an all-through school, they've just got their secondary students back. But what they're doing is they've separated the school into Group A and Group B, and they have a 2-week timetable. So Group A comes into school in week 1 and then learns at home during week 2. And Group B, it's the other way around. They're in school during week 2, and then the next week they're learning at home. The biggest challenge for them now is to get the teachers not to pile a huge amount of work on that at-home week, because they think they've got to give them loads of work. They're really trying to tailor the work so that they're preparing things to bring back into school for the next week. So it's a big challenge, but it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that. I also asked people to give advice to each other. Well, just about life at the moment in terms of being in school and life in lockdown. And this is what people said. And the most striking thing for me here is how many of the inclusive values there are in here about being open and non-judgmental and reflective and kind, and collaborating and communicating, and all of those things that we know makes a really good inclusive school. They are here. For school leaders, these are the messages. Please be as clear as you can, with the real understanding that we know you can't be it sometimes because it's not clear for you, but be as clear as you can with us. Walk your talk, the inclusive talk, then we can as well. It really helps us do that. Please keep a focus on well-being, not just on academic outcomes and on health and safety. And as far as you can, plan ahead and involve us. We really want to help and use our strengths. And for policymakers, these were short-term and long-term needs. We need you to be clear and detailed. Across the world, there is a whole range of types of clarity and detail in terms of what countries are giving to schools. So in Lebanon, the government's dysfunctional, so there is not a great deal of clear stuff going on in there. And my experience of Greece, having been here in lockdown, is it's extremely clear. Please visit when it's safe or virtually. There's a real focus on schools being different now because of COVID. So needing policymakers to understand that on a personal level. So not just writing about policy, but actually going in and talking to people, or doing what I did and talking to people virtually if you can't go in. And I know that this is starting to happen in England, and there was a big worry about it because it's the inspection arm going in to do it. And even though Ofsted is the inspection arm, even though Ofsted said it's fine, we're just coming to listen, there was a lot of suspicion. but that is now going down, and people are finding the visits quite helpful because the inspectors are really listening. Please, policymakers, you have to address the digital divide, otherwise it's not going to be equitable. This was particularly Greece. Please make sure your national resources are up to date and also adapted for everybody. And there we go. Emotional and mental health, really important. Please don't forget it. It's got to be a focus going forward. Medium and long term is about initial teacher training curricula, making sure that inclusion is integral, but also an addition here, distance learning is covered so that people are coming out of teacher training schools able to deliver effective technological distance learning. And then please adequately resource the changes you want to see and work with us and work with everybody else to make sure this happens. So in conclusion, this is going back to stories. We've had a story theme going on this afternoon. So this is from an English, a UK fairy story. It's probably other people as well, but I don't know. It's called The Magic Porridge Pot. And the magic porridge pot is a pot that just keeps producing porridge day in, day out, and it's delicious and lovely and nutritious. And this image came to me while I was putting this presentation together about this is what's been happening. Schools have been overflowing during lockdown and return with all of this amazing and nutritious porridge. Really, it's nurturing people, it's feeding people, it's making sure they're okay, it's making sure they can get through the day. And my concern is whether this will be able to, how long this will be able to continue. And I think we need to be very mindful that our teachers and parents and children, but particularly the teachers in school, they need to have the right kind of time given to them to be able to work through things, and they need to have realistic expectations put upon them. And I think that's really key. Otherwise, I worry that the pot might even explode and we'll have a really difficult situation on our hands with schools. And I think this quote, which I really like, is a place that we need to go back to and a starting point for going forward. It's about human flourishing. If we remember that education is about human flourishing, it's not just about the academic stuff, and it's not about a sausage factory to prepare people to go into the workplace. It's not just about children either. It's about all the adults that work in schools and with schools, and it's about the parents who look after the children as well in the schools. If we can work out how we get those schools to flourish together, then that's a great starting point. And that's what inclusion, when done well, actually does. So if we can remember this human flourishing within everything that's going on, then surely that's a really good starting point. And that's me. I'm going to stop talking now. And here's the link. Thank you very much to Inclusive Schools. And if anybody has any questions, we have a few minutes.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining this interesting webinar.